We're now going to talk about how the whole muscle is going to contract. We've talked about how one muscle fiber kind of receives a nerve impulse and starts to contract, but how does that affect an entire muscle? So we'll talk about how that happens and these graded responses, which is kind of the recruitment and also the length of time a muscle will contract. So up until now, we've talked about the contraction of a single muscle fiber, but the same principles are going to apply when we talk about a whole muscle. And we're going to start talking about something called muscle tension. And so tension is going to be the force exerted on a load or an object to be moved. And so you're picking up your cell phone, you're going to have some amount of muscle tension to be able to bring that cell phone up so that you can then look at it. Now, the force and duration of a contraction will vary with the type of stimuli and how the frequency of that stimuli varies and the intensity of that stimuli. And so we can have different types of muscle contractions depending on those two things. Now, each muscle is going to be served by at least one motor nerve, and a nerve is going to be a large collection of neurons. So a motor nerve contains axons of up to hundreds of motor neurons, okay? So when we look at this image on over here, when we are talking about the actual nerve, the nerve is going to be this large section right here, and then in that, you would then have multiple neurons, okay? And those are going to be motor neurons because they're going to then kind of terminate onto a muscle fiber. And so they will then have a neuromuscular junction with a muscle fiber, and that will allow those muscle fibers to contract. A motor unit is going to be the nerve muscle functional unit. So kind of the entire nerve that's serving this muscle, including the entire muscle itself. So a motor unit will consist of the motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it's going to supply to. And that can vary from 4 to several hundred muscle fibers. Now, there are certain muscles that are going to have fewer fibers, but are going to have greater fine control. And so you can think of things like your hand, which we need extremely fine motor skills in order for us to manipulate little things, that there are less muscle fibers, but we're going to have greater control over those muscle fibers. Now, when we have kind of the neuron that's going to serve these different muscles, the motor unit is going to be spread throughout the entire muscle so that you can then have simultaneous contraction, okay? If you have a single motor unit that is stimulated, it'll cause a weak contraction of the entire muscle. Now, the simplest contraction is going to be when there is kind of one action potential coming in from a motor neuron that's causing a muscle fiber to contract. And the contraction is going to have different stages, and you can actually look at these stages by kind of doing something called a myogram. And so the myogram is going to be able to record the full force of contraction over time. Okay, so it's a graphical recording of muscle activity, and it creates this tracing, which is the line recording contraction activity. And so on this image, you can see that there is initial period called latent period, then we have contraction period, and then relaxation period. And that is going to have different forces of contraction at those different points, and they're going to last for different time periods. Now, the first stage of a muscle twitch is called the latent period, and during this time we're having the excitation contraction coupling events that we've talked about previously. During this time there is no actual muscle tension, and so you actually are staying at zero even though the stimulus has come into the muscle. Okay, so it looks like nothing's happening. However, a lot is happening during this time, and so let's go over that quickly. So if you remember, an action potential will travel down the axon to the neuromuscular junction. When the action potential reaches the axon terminal, calcium will enter because the voltage changes and calcium channels open. Calcium will enter the presynaptic terminal and cause acetylcholine to be released from the presynaptic vesicles. The acetylcholine will then stimulate sodium channels that are on the postsynaptic membrane to open. And so this is now on the muscle, the sarcolemma. And the sodium will diffuse into the muscle cell, which initiates action potential that travels along the sarcolemma to the T-tubule. Once the action potential is in the T-tubule, that will then cause calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum in the terminal cisterns. And the calcium that's released will then bind to troponin on actin, which moves tropomyosin and exposes the myosin attachment sites. And now we are ready for myosin to bind to actin and to start the actual contraction. So the latent phase is first, and then the period of contraction starts. And this is when cross bridge formation is allowed to happen. So initially you're going to have kind of not very much contraction, but it's going to kind of build as we go through this time. And this can last from 10 to 100 milliseconds long. So during this time, tension will increase, and so you're going to start to see an increase in tension on our graph. So if you look at our graph, we're going to start moving up, 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 until we get to kind of the point of maximal contraction for this specific muscle twitch. From the onset of the shortening to the peak of contraction is the time period that we are going to consider the period of contraction. After that, once we've reached the peak contraction, we are then going to go into the period of relaxation. Now, during this time, the main thing that's happening is that calcium is going to go back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which means that troponin will no longer be attached to calcium, and tropomyosin is going to move back over and block those myosin binding sites. Okay, so at this point, we go from being tensed to the point where we are at relaxation, which is no tension. Now, muscle will contract much quicker than it relaxes, and so this period of relaxation is actually quite long. And we are going to now talk about kind of how we can go from kind of a single muscle twitch to then an actual muscle contraction that's going to let us do some work. Before we move on, let's talk about different muscles, because muscles are going to have different types of muscle twitches and different speeds. And these are going to be differences in strength and duration because of different metabolic properties of these different muscles. So for example, the eye muscles are going to contract and do this very, very quickly, and it's going to be very brief. And so all of this happens before we even hit 40 milliseconds, so very quickly. But muscles that are larger and kind of, for example, these fleshy ones of our kind of lower leg and the calf muscles, they're going to contract slower and longer. And so we have the gastrocnemius and the soleus, which are two muscles that are going to be in your lower leg, kind of in the calf area. And so the gastrocnemius has kind of a different type of muscle twitch than we have in the soleus. So now we're going to start talking about graded muscle responses. And these are going to deal with variations in the degree of muscle contraction. Contractions normally don't occur as a single twitch. Those are just kind of weird things that happen. But we're going to be talking about now as a whole muscle, how it's going to contract. Now, a graded muscle response is going to vary the strength of contraction for different demands, because we do not want our muscles to always go all out as strong as possible every single time, because there are certain types of activities we want where we need to have fine control over our skeletal muscles. Okay, and so to have control over skeletal muscles, we have to be able to grade our muscle responses, which means that we're going to kind of vary how long they last and also how strong they are. So the two main things that we can kind of grade our responses by is changing the frequency of stimulation. This is going to have to do with time. So kind of how often is the muscle being stimulated in time. And if it's fast enough stimulation in the frequency, then we can have kind of a full muscle contraction that we'll talk about. This is going to deal with wave summation, which I'll talk about. It has to do with that myogram that we talked about and how we had just a single muscle contraction twitch. We're now going to have kind of those waves where they're going to start to blend together and ultimately lead to something called tetanus. The second is going to be changing the strength of the stimulation. So when we have multiple motor units going to summation at once, we're going to call this recruitment. So you're kind of recruiting more muscles. You don't have to recruit the entire muscle when you do certain contractions, but you can, and so you would then vary the recruitment of muscle fibers that you're actually working with. So we're going to first look at how muscles will respond to changes in the stimulus frequency. Now, this graph is going to show single muscle twitches that have a period of relaxation between them. So you're going to see that we have kind of the latent period, we're going to have the contraction and relaxation, but then there's going to be this brief period right here of relaxation, and we get complete relaxation between the next stimulus. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to start making it so the stimuli are actually going to happen quicker, and the muscle is actually not going to be able to completely relax. So now is going to be the situation when we start to have multiple stimuli that are going to come in succession of one another, so right after each other, and the muscle is not going to be able to relax completely between them. And so this is going to be called wave summation or temporal summation. The word temporal means time. And so this is when you're going to have two stimuli that are received by a muscle in rapid succession. So the muscle fiber will not be able to completely relax after the stimuli. And so remember, during the relaxation period, what's happening is that calcium is going to be taken back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But if we have the next muscle contraction start to happen prior to all of the calcium being released, we will then have additional calcium that's going to be released when this new action potential comes in, which is then going to cause the second stimulus to have even more shortening than before. Now, when the frequency increases near maximum, so there's going to be a certain point where the muscle will not be able to contract any quicker, okay, because there's this absolute refractory period that has to do with some of the ion channels where they will not be able to respond to a voltage change until a certain period of time has passed. Okay, so before we get to that point where we're at the absolute refractory period, there is going to be a point where we start to get to this maximum number of contractions within a certain period of time. And so this is going to produce smooth, continuous contractions that are going to be added. So again, kind of summating these waves together. Now, if you have even further frequency, so you increase the frequency of the stimuli, the muscle is going to then contract and have the sustained kind of quivering contraction, which is going to be referred to as unfused or incomplete tetanus. So kind of the quivering is that we're not quite kind of solid yet. And then finally, if the stimuli is increased even further, you will reach maximum muscle tension and you will have fused tetanus. So this is going to be kind of a smooth, sustained contraction where you hit plateau. And so this is kind of the final point that the muscle can contract at. So if there are going to be any more stimuli any quicker, you're not actually going to be able to do anything more than this highest level of muscle tension because there are going to be limits. Okay. This type of fused tetanus is going to cause muscle fatigue. So if you've ever kind of picked up something and tried to hold it straight out away from your body at shoulder level, after a while your arm is going to become really tired because your arm is at full tetanus when you're doing that, and if it has enough weight, and so you're going to start to shake and your muscle is going to fatigue. So now let's summarize what happens when a muscle is responding to changes in the stimulus frequency. So if we increase the rate of the stimulus, that means that the relaxation time between contractions will become shorter, and then we will have successive contractions summed together. Now, the second stimulus must occur after the absolute refractory period is over, but prior to the muscle fiber completely relaxing. If there are too rapid of the stimulation, then there will be no additional response. And all of this is timed out perfectly by the motor neurons. So they're able to make sure that they are going to stimulate the muscle fiber after the absolute refractory period has happened, but before the muscle fiber has completely relaxed. Now, once we have sustained contraction, this is called tetanus. So now we're going to look at how muscles respond when there's a change in the stimulus strength. So this is going to be called recruitment or multiple motor unit summation. And so summation is just adding them together. And this is when a stimulus is going to be sent to more muscle fibers, leading to more precise control. Now, there are going to be different types of stimulus involved in the recruitment. There's going to be something called sub-threshold stimulus, which means that the stimulus is not strong enough, so no contractions are actually seen. And I'm going to now try to draw, this is the threshold line. Sorry, that's not perfect, but you have to have the voltage stimulus be higher than that threshold line in order for there to be an actual contraction. And so if you look at these first 2 or 3 stimuli to the nerves, they're sub-threshold, and so they won't actually cause any contraction. If you look down in the next image, you're going to see that during this period of time, we have no muscle fibers actually recruited in the first 2, and then it looks like we're just actually at the threshold and starting to recruit our very first muscle fibers for contraction. Okay, if we look at tension, the first subthreshold is going to have 0 tension at that point. We then are going to move on to the threshold stimulus. So this is going to be anything that starts to go over that purple line that I drew in for you. And that will be kind of this next portion, so around 4 to right around 7. Actually, let me just move that so you don't see right here. And so those are going to be when the stimulus is strong enough to cause your first observable contractions. Okay, and then once we get to this next step, which is going to be the maximal, so the maximal is going to be the point where the muscle is no longer going to be able to contract any faster than it's already going. And so I'm going to draw this right here. So at this blue line, once you can continue to increase the stimulus voltage, but it's not going to make a difference in how the muscle is contracting because your muscle is completely maxed out. Every single motor unit has been recruited and every muscle fiber is contracting. And so there is no kind of additional response after that point. Now, you can also look at something called the size principle for recruitment. Okay, and so motor units with the smallest muscle fibers are going to be recruited first. And so if you look at this graph, we see that these smaller muscle fibers are going to be the ones that are going to be the very first to be recruited. They don't have kind of as high of a threshold to start to contract. We then will move on to even larger and larger fibers as there's higher recruitment with this increased intensity of the voltage. Okay, once the largest motor units are activated, those are only going to be for the most powerful contractions. And after that, there are no larger motor units. Now, the motor units are going to contract usually asynchronously, which means that they are not happening at the same time. And this is going to then allow for some of the muscles to be kind of resting while other muscle fibers are continuing to contract. And so they kind of vary and are not all being contracted at the same time. This helps prevent fatigue. At some point you will get fatigue, but this will kind of prolong that period of time. So let's just do a little summation of this last type of how we can vary the strength of contraction. So again, it's going to be called recruitment. And when you are talking about stimulus strength, we're talking about the voltage. So higher voltage changes are going to cause higher stimulus. This is going to cause more acetylcholine to bind, more action potentials, more fiber contractions. So we're going to kind of increase the amount of muscle fibers that are actually involved. The more muscle fibers respond to stimulus as the voltage increases, and there are these thresholds that have to be passed in order for the muscles to actually start to contract. The first noticeable contractions will occur once the threshold is reached, and then we ultimately will get to a point where we have kind of a maximum stimulus that can then not be increased anymore. And so at that point, all of the motor units are responding and you are at maximal strength of contraction. Okay, so any increases in the stimulus will not cause contraction to increase. Now we're going to move on to muscle tone. Muscle tone is not going to be kind of how we use it in everyday language of, very defined and you can see the muscles from the outside. Muscle tone actually just means a constant, slightly contracted state of all muscles. And these are going to be due to spinal reflexes, and you have these different group of motor units that are going to kind of activate at different times in response to kind of input from different parts of the body and these stretch receptors. They're going to help, this muscle tone keeps the muscle firm, healthy, and ready to respond at all times. And it's also going to help in joint stability. We use this type of muscle tone for posture and maintenance. So being able to keep your head erect and not flopping over is muscle tone. It has to do with that. And you'll notice that babies do not have that ability. And so this is something that has to actually be built up over time. It does not result in movement. So you can be standing completely still and have muscle tone happening because you are standing up and you need to have muscles that are going to be contracted for that to happen. And again, babies can't hold up their head because they do not have kind of muscle tone right after they're born. And so here are some just pictures of babies. The whole tummy time type thing is to help the baby start to kind of work out those muscles and be able to hold their heads up. So each of these babies now has the ability to kind of keep their heads up and erect, and so they now have muscle tone in those muscles. So there are going to be different types of contractions when we look at kind of how we're moving our muscles. And so if we have a force of the contraction that is greater than the load, then we are going to have muscles that are going to shorten and we're going to have a movement occur. And so I'm going to show you pictures of this, but I kind of wanted to get these details out first. This is going to be called an isotonic contraction. Okay, so your muscle is going to shorten and you're going to have movement occur. So if you have something that you're picking up, you are then going to be able to pick it up because the force of the contraction of your muscle is going to be greater than the weight or the load of the item. And that will then cause your muscle to shorten and you'll have movement of that item up off of the surface that it was on. And that's going to be isotonic contraction. If, however, the load is greater than the force of the contraction, then we're going to have a different situation where the muscle length does not change and the load does not move, but you are going to have contraction taking place. And this is called isometric contraction. And so I'm going to give you an example of this as well. So if you go to your wall and try to push on your wall as hard as you can, you will be contracting your muscles. You will not be moving anything. And your muscle is actually not going to change in length. And this will be called isometric contraction. So we're first going to talk about isotonic contractions. And in this situation, you're going to have muscle changes in the length and you're going to have the load being moved. And so as you can see, Ron Burgundy here working out his guns, he's going to be picking up this weight and is actually going to be moving it. And so the muscle in his bicep is going to kind of shorten and he's going to move that load. So isotonic contractions can be either concentric or eccentric. And concentric are going to be when you are shortening the muscle and it does work. Okay, so what we have in kind of Ron Burgundy's case is he is doing a concentric contraction. So biceps contract to pick up a book. He's not picking up a book, but same situation. And then eccentric contractions are going to be when the muscle lengthens and generates force. Okay, so this would be kind of the opposite, where if he was then to like throw the actual weight down on the ground and lengthen his muscle, that would then generate some force. So if you, for example, lay down a book and causes the bicep to lengthen while generating a force. The next is isometric contractions. And isometric contractions are going to be these contractions where the load is greater than the maximum tension of the muscle, and you are basically not lengthening or shortening the muscle, but you're kind of in the static hold. So your muscles are definitely contracted, but nothing is shortening or lengthening. So there are lots of exercises that do this. So this woman doing this kind of inverted or V sit-up type thing, if she is sitting in this one position and not moving, she's going to have kind of the muscles at the same length, but she's going to be contracted. So when we're looking at isotonic and isometric contractions, they're going to have the same electrochemical and mechanical events happening, but they're going to have different results. So in an isotonic contraction, the myosin will move the actin, shortening the sarcomere, and cause movement. So you're going to see that in these two upper cases of this muscle contraction right here. So you're actually going to have kind of a change in the muscle. Okay. When we have an isometric contraction, the cross bridges will generate force, but the sarcomere does not shorten. And the myosin heads are basically spinning their wheels on the actin binding sites. And so they're kind of binding continuously to the same actin and not moving the actin kind of how it does normally. So here is just kind of a picture of how all of this works. So we have kind of an isotonic contraction versus an isometric contraction. In the first part of the box, you have like actual muscle that's attached to a weight. And in the first one, we have a weight of 3 kilograms, and the muscle is able to have enough force to lift that load. Okay. In the second isometric, it's now 6 kilograms, and that is kind of exceeds the capacity of that muscle, and so the muscle can become tense, but it will not be able to actually move the load. Okay, and so you can see kind of in the tension developed in these two different situations, they're actually going to be different. So peak tension in the isometric can actually be higher than what we have in the isotonic, and the length of kind of the muscle compared to the resting length is going to be different in these two. So the length of the muscle does not change at all in the actual isometric situation, as you can see here, but it is going to change in the isotonic situation.